If you've been following the IRS Notice series, we've reached an important turning point. We started with the CP14, then the CP501, then the CP503, and last week we discussed the CP504. Throughout those videos, you've watched the IRS become progressively more direct about an unpaid tax balance. But today's letter is different. Today, we're going to be talking about IRS letter 1058. And this is one of those letters you absolutely do not want to set aside and deal with later. Why? Because letter 1058 is a final notice. More specifically, it's a notice of intent to levy and notice of your rights to a collection due process hearing. That second part is extremely important because this letter isn't only telling you what the IRS may do next, it's also telling you about important rights you have before certain collection actions move forward. Today, we're going to walk through an actual letter 1058 together. We'll discuss what makes this letter different from the notices we've already covered. What the IRS means by a final notice of intent to levy, what a collection due process hearing is, why the deadline on this letter matters, and what can happen if you don't respond. My name is Shane Harris. I'm an enrolled agent with Profit First Taxes, and every week I help taxpayers understand IRS notices, resolve tax problems, and make informed decisions before situations become much more serious. Now, let's get started. If you've been following this series, you probably already know where today's letter belongs. Letter 1058 is read on the Profit First Taxes IRS stress scale. Red means immediate attention. This is no longer simply the IRS reminding you that there's an unpaid balance. The IRS is notifying you of its intent to levy, and it's providing you with information about your right to request a collection due process hearing. That's a major difference. And I want to be careful about something here. Receiving letter 1058 does not mean the IRS has already taken money from your bank accounts or started garnishing your wages. But it does mean that you've reached a more serious point in the collection process. This is exactly why red means don't ignore it. Read it. Understand your rights. Pay attention to the deadline and determine what actions you need to take. Let's look at where we've arrived. We started with the CP14, the first balance due notice in our series. Then the 501, then CP503, and finally CP504. Each step showed us the IRS becoming progressively more serious about collecting the unpaid balance. Now we've reached letter 1058, and there's something I really want you to understand. We're no longer just talking about another reminder notice. We're talking about a final notice of intent to levy that also provides information about your rights to request a collection due process hearing. That's why understanding the progression matters. If you only look at one IRS letter by itself, you may not understand how important it is. But when you understand where the letter falls in the collection process, the picture becomes much clearer. Now let's look at the actual letter 1058. The first thing I look for is exactly what we've been doing throughout this entire series. I identify the notice or letter number. In this case, it's letter 1058. Then my eyes immediately move to the center of the page. And this is where I want you to slow down, because those words tell us exactly why this letter deserves immediate attention. Final notice. Please respond immediately. notice of intent to levy, and your right to a collection due process hearing. Every part of that title matters. The IRS is telling you what collection action it intends to pursue. But it's also telling you that you have an opportunity to exercise important taxpayers' rights. And there's another section on this page that we absolutely need to discuss. In the sample we're reviewing today, the taxpayer is instructed to complete Form 12153, request for a collection due process or equivalent hearing, or submit a written request containing the same information. And here's the part I don't want you to overlook. There's a deadline. That date isn't something I want you guessing at. Look at your own letter 1058. Identify the deadline printed on your letter, because missing the timely collection due process hearing deadline can affect the rights and procedures available to you. We're going to talk much more about that as we continue through this letter. But for now, I want you to remember this. When you receive letter 1058, don't just look at the amount you owe. Look at your rights. Look at your deadline. And understand exactly what the IRS is telling you before you decide what to do next. Now, let's continue working our way through the letter 1058. The section titled, Why We're Sending You This Letter, gets directly to the point. The IRS says your federal tax lien is still unpaid. It explains that it previously asked you to pay the tax, but according to its records, it still hasn't received payment. Then the letter explains why the letter 1058 is different. It says this letter is your notice of IRS intent to levy and your rights to request either a collection due process hearing or an equivalent hearing. With the IRS Independent Office of Appeals, those are important rights, and I don't want to rush past them. Let's talk about the collection due process hearing first. A collection due process hearing, often called a CDP hearing, provides taxpayers with an opportunity to have certain IRS collection matters reviewed by the IRS Independent Office of Appeals. And one of the most important things about the CDP process, it's timing. Remember the deadline we identified on the first page. The sample letter we're reviewing tells the taxpayer to submit the hearing request by the date stated on the letter. That's why I keep emphasizing read your own notice. Don't assume your deadline is the same as someone else's. There's another reason the timely CDP deadline matters. The sample letter 1058 explains that if the taxpayer doesn't request a CDP hearing by the stated deadline, their ability to contest an appeals decision in the United States tax court will generally be limited. That's a significant distinction. This isn't simply about whether you can talk to someone at the IRS. We're talking about procedural rights that can be affected by whether you respond on time. Now, this is where another term appears. Equivalent hearing. The letter explains that a request received after the timely CDP deadline would generally be considered timely if the request is properly addressed and corrected within the time period described in the letter. And if the request is sent after the CDP deadline, the letter explains that the taxpayer may still be entitled to a hearing. However, their rights to contest the appeals decision in tax court will generally be limited. That's why a CDP hearing and an equivalent hearing should not automatically be treated as though they're exactly the same thing. We're going to dedicate a separate video later in this series to collection due process hearings and another to equivalent hearings, because those subjects deserve much more attention than we can give them during today's notice walkthrough. For now, the most important thing I want you to understand is this. If your letter 1058 gives a deadline to request a collection due process hearing, pay attention to that deadline. Don't assume that you can miss it and have exactly the same rights later. Let's look at the section titled, What You Need to Do. The letter tells the taxpayer to pay the balance in full to prevent additional collection action. It provides instructions for making the payment, and it explains that additional penalties and interest may continue if payment is made after the deadline stated in the letter. But remember something that we've discussed throughout the entire series. Not every taxpayer receiving an IRS collection notice is in the same financial situation. Some taxpayers may be able to pay the balance due. Others may need to explore a collection alternative. Some may disagree with part of the liability, and some may have other issues that need to be addressed. That's why understanding the letter comes before assuming there's only one possible response. Now that we're getting into one of the most serious sections of the 1058, page 2 tells us what the IRS says it may do. First, the letter explains that the IRS may file a notice of federal tax lien to protect the government's interests. And notice something important. The letter specifically explains that a notice of federal tax lien may be filed even if you request a hearing. That's important because taxpayers sometimes assume requesting a hearing automatically prevents every possible IRS collection related action. That's not what this letter is saying. Then the language becomes even more direct. The letter explains that if the taxpayer doesn't pay, make alternative payment arrangements to pay, or request a collection due process hearing by the deadline, the IRS may take collection action against property or rights to property. And then it gives examples: wages, Social Security benefits, real estate, automobiles, business assets, bank accounts, accounts receivable, and other income. This is why letter 1058 is read on the Profit First Taxes IRS stress scale. We're no longer discussing what might happen several notices from now. The IRS is identifying specific types of property and income that may be subject to collection action if the situation remains unresolved. But I want to make an important distinction. Letter 1058 is a notice of intent to levy. It is not the same thing as saying every asset on this list has already been levied. Those are two very different statements. Intent to levy and an actual levy are not the same thing. Understanding that distinction can help you take the situation seriously without assuming something has already happened when it really hasn't. There's one more major warning on this page that many taxpayers don't expect to see in an IRS collection letter. And that's where we're going to next. It's titled Denial or Revocation of United States Passport. Now, receiving letter 1058 does not automatically mean that your passport is being revoked. That's an important distinction. What this section does is explain another potential consequence associated with seriously delinquent tax debt. The letter explains that the IRS is required to notify the U.S. Department of State of taxpayers certified as having seriously delinquent tax debt. And if the State Department receives that certification, it generally will not issue or renew a passport to that taxpayer. The letter also explains that if you currently have a valid passport, the State Department may revoke it or limit your ability to travel outside of the United States. The sample we are reviewing provides a specific dollar threshold for seriously delinquent tax debt. That threshold can change over time. So don't use the dollar amount on this sample letter to determine whether your own tax debt meets the current threshold. Look at the information on your own notice and current IRS guidance. Notice what else this letter is telling the taxpayer. It says they may still avoid certification if they pay the amount due. Make alternative arrangements to pay or request the collection due process hearing by the date stated in this letter. Again, we are seeing why the deadline on this letter 1058 matters. Next, the letter discusses interest and penalty charges. If you've watched the previous episodes in this series, this part should sound familiar. The IRS explains that interest generally continues while the liabilities remain unpaid. It also discusses failure to pay penalty. But there is a statement here that becomes especially relevant now that we've reached the levy stage of the collection process. The letter explains that if the IRS issues a notice of intent to levy and the balance isn't paid within the time frame described in the letter, the failure to pay penalty increases to 1% per month. Again, this is another example of why waiting can make the IRS balance more expensive over time. The original tax doesn't simply sit there unchanged. Interest and applicable penalties can continue affecting the balance. Page 3 also provides several resources. The letter directs taxpayers to information about a taxpayer's rights, their IRS online account, and resources that may be available to qualifying low-income taxpayers. It also references two publications we've discussed throughout this series. Publication 594, The Collection Process, and Publication 1660, Collection Appeal Rights. Those publications become especially relevant at this stage because we're no longer dealing with only the balance due reminders. We're dealing with collection action and appeals rights. Now look at the enclosure listed at the bottom of this sample. You'll see a copy of the letter, Publication 594, Publication 1660, and Form 12153. Forms 12153 is the request for a collection due process or equivalent hearing. That's the form referenced on page 1 when the letter explains how to request an appeals hearing. So, if you receive letter 1058, don't automatically throw away the additional pages or enclosures. They may contain information directly related to the rights explained in the letter. There's something else about the sample we're using today that I want you to notice. Look at the bottom of the page 3. This is particularly letter 1058 is signed by a revenue officer. That's useful information when reviewing this specific taxpayer's collection situation. It tells us that this particular letter came from an assigned revenue officer. But don't assume that every letter 1058 you will see look exactly like this sample, or that every taxpayer receiving one is necessarily in the exact same collection procedure. Remember, we're using this letter to learn how to read and understand the notice that's actually in front of you. Now, let's look at the final page. This is another reason I tell taxpayers read the entire letter. Page 4 contains a table showing the amount the IRS says this taxpayer owes. And this particular sample isn't dealing with one tax period. There are multiple periods. Most of the liabilities shown are from 941 employment tax periods, and those are also Form 940 periods. The table separates the unpaid amount from the prior notices, additional applicable penalties, additional interest, and the amount currently owed for each period. And at the bottom, the total shown on this sample, letter 1058, is $350,379.12. That's a significant balance. But here's what I don't want you to do. Don't look at this sample and assume letter 1058 is only sent to taxpayers who owe hundreds and thousands of dollars. We're reviewing the facts shown on this particular letter. Your situation may involve a very different balance, different tax periods, different tax types, and different collection circumstances. What matters is understanding what your own letter 1058 is saying. At this point, we've seen why letter 1058 deserves immediate attention. It's a final notice of intent to levy. It explains your rights to request a collection due process hearing. It provides a deadline for the exercising that right. It describes property and income the IRS may pursue throughout collection action. It discusses potential passport consequences for seriously delinquent tax debts. And it provides information about appeals and other IRS resources. That's a lot happening in one letter. But the goal isn't to panic. The goal is understanding exactly where you are in the collection process, understanding the rights the IRS is telling you about, and making an informed decision before important deadlines passes. So now, let's answer the question that's probably on your mind. What happens if you receive letter 1058 and you don't respond? The letter itself tells us if you don't pay the amount owed, make alternative arrangements to pay, or request a collection due process hearing by the deadline stated in your letter, the IRS says it may take collection action against your property or rights to property. That may include your wages, bank accounts, Social Security benefits, real estate, automobiles, business assets, accounts receivables, and other income. That's why we've classified letter 1058 as a red on the Profit First Taxes IRS stress scale. This is not a notice I recommend putting in a drawer and saying, I'll deal with it later. There's a deadline attached that is important to taxpayers' rights. And the IRS is telling you what collection actions may follow if the situation remains unresolved. But I want to reinforce something that we've discussed throughout today's video. A notice of intent to levy is not the same thing as an actual levy. Receiving the letter 1058 doesn't mean the IRS has already emptied your bank account or that your employer is already sending part of your paychecks to the IRS. What it means is that you've reached a serious stage in the collection process where the IRS is notifying you of its intent to levy and informing you of your rights to request the collection due process hearing. That's why understanding the letter and responding appropriately matters. Question number 1, is the letter 1058 more serious than the CP 504? The answer is yes. CP 504 introduced the levy language and explained that the IRS may levy certain property, including your state tax refund. Letter 1058 is different because it is a final notice of intent to levy and it provides information about your rights to request a collection due process hearing. That's an important procedural difference. Question number 2. Does letter 1058 mean the IRS has already levied my bank account? No. Letter 1058 is a notice of intent to levy. It's telling you what the IRS intends to do if the situation remains unresolved. An actual levy is a separate collection action. Question number 3. How long do I have to respond? Don't use a deadline you heard in this YouTube video or a date from someone else's IRS letter. Look at your own letter 1058. The sample that we're reviewing today contains a specific deadline for requesting a collection due process hearing. Your responsibility is to identify and follow the deadlines that is stated on your own letter. Question number 4. What is Form 12153? Form 12153 is the request for a collection due process or equivalent hearing. The sample letter 1058 that we're reviewing specifically identifies Form 12153 when explaining how the taxpayer can request an appeals hearing. Question number 5. What happens if I miss the collection due process deadline? The sample letter explains that a taxpayer who submits the request after the timely CDP deadline may still be entitled to a hearing. However, it also explains that the taxpayer's right to contest an appeals decision in the United States tax court will generally be limited. That's why I don't recommend treating the deadline as optional. Question number 6. Does requesting a hearing stop the IRS from filing a federal tax lien? Not necessarily. The letter 1058 that we're reviewing specifically states that the IRS may file a notice of federal tax lien even if the taxpayer requests a hearing. That's another reason it's important to understand exactly what rights a collection due process hearing provides and what it doesn't automatically prevent. Question number 7. Can the IRS really levy wages and bank accounts after this? The letter specifically identifies wages, bank accounts, Social Security benefits, real estates, automobiles, business assets, account receivables, and other income as property or rights to property against which the IRS may take collection action if the taxpayer doesn't pay, make alternative arrangements, or request collection due process hearing by the stated deadline. Exactly what happens in an individual case depends on that taxpayer's circumstances. Question number 8. Should I handle letter 1058 myself or contact a professional? Well, that depends on your situation. Some taxpayers may be comfortable reviewing the letter, understanding the liability, and determine how they want to respond. But if you're dealing with the multiple tax periods, a significant balance, business or payroll tax liabilities, potential levy actions, or you're unsure how to protect your appeal rights, this may be a point where professional guidance becomes particularly valuable. The important thing is not to ignore the letter while you're deciding what you want to do. Let's wrap everything up. Today, we learned that letter 1058 represents a major point in the IRS collection process. It's a final notice of intent to levy and notice of your rights to collection due process hearing. We discussed why this letter is different from the earlier notices in our series, why the deadline matters, the difference between a collection due process hearing and an equivalent hearing, the type of property and income the IRS says may be subject to collection action, the possibility of a notice of federal tax lien, the passport information included in this particular letter, and why reading every page and enclosure is important. But if there's one thing I want you to remember from today's video, it's this. Letter 1058 isn't just telling you what the IRS may do. It's also telling you about rights you may have before certain collection actions move forward. Don't overlook that part of the letter. Read it carefully, pay attention to the deadline, and make informed decisions about what you are going to do next. If you're dealing with letter 1058, IRS notices, unfiled tax returns, tax debts, penalty, potential levy action, or another IRS collection issue, Profit First Taxes is here to help. Visit the link in the description below to schedule a consultation and discuss your situation. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell. Every week, I'm going to share educational videos designed to help you understand the IRS collection process and your available options. Next week, we're going to talk about another term that you've heard repeatedly throughout this series, the federal tax lien. We'll discuss what a federal tax lien actually is, how it's different from an IRS levy, what a notice of federal tax lien means, and why understanding that distinction is so important when you're dealing with the IRS collection problems. You do not want to miss it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.